It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm glad that we've done our introductions. It's nice to see everybody. We've talked a bit about this panel. In my role as a broadcaster, I've talked to about 250 not-for-profits in the past couple of years. And one observation for me is that many of the people that I've talked to in different organizations such as yours are disappointed, disillusioned, burned out, and tired because they're so overwhelmed. And this panel hopefully will help you and help those other groups find some inspiration, hopefully some resources that might relieve some of that stress and some of that pressure. If I have not talked to you, please seek me out or call me because we would love to share your story on our radio station. Every year it seems more challenging for not-for-profits to increase fundraising with higher donor expectations, increased regulations, cuts to traditional funding streams, and more competition. So the first question to our panel is, what's your advice on how charities or not-for-profits can become more competitive and more resilient, and how can they diversify their fundraising efforts? So there's a lot in there, so take your time. Who wants to go first?
Okay, they're looking at me. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about diversification. I think, as you guys probably see and feel, there's a lot of noise out here, right? There's a lot of fundraising noise. Social media has really opened the floodgates for everybody to create their own type of campaign for one cause or another. So my first piece of advice would be to make your passion stand out. Find a way to have people advocate for you that maybe don't work for the organization but are volunteers, supporters, advocates, donors. Have them help spread your message, because there's nothing better than a referral from a friend or someone that you know. There was a lot in that question, but that'll be my first tidbit, and then we'll
Okay, Tessica.
Definitely. I think jumping in the second piece, and many of you have heard of this concept already, but the concept of collective impact. So looking at how to not recreate the wheel, but work with other organizations that have similar missions or mandates, or finding corporations or public institutions that have similar missions and mandates, and figuring out how you can work collectively. I find that oftentimes in the nonprofit, because of the scarcity of resources, that there's often this secretivity or this kind of protectiveness of your projects and your ideas, but rather instead of looking at that and looking at that as an opportunity to look at how we can leverage each other's resources or different assets as organizations. Because the reality is that if your organization or your nonprofit exists, it is serving a specific niche, but it's part of a broader movement, it's part of a broader impact. And so looking at ways to have collective impact. And if there are granting organizations out here, I think thinking really about the role that you have as a granting organization to connect organizations that might not already be talking to each other, but might be working in similar spaces, so that you can connect them to each other and talk about, if you have similar objectives over similar timelines, how can you actually leverage those most effectively, and require that to be stipulations, so that when folks are applying for grants, that they're working together with others in their field to come with a bigger network, a bigger resource, and a breadth of experience.
Praveen from 30,000 feet, what do you think?
So hands up here who is not working hard. I think that guy's going to be fired. No. I'm in the venture capital business, and we meet people all the time, a lot of entrepreneurs, and you ask them, are you working hard? And everybody says, I'm working hard. And you've heard this line before. It's not about working hard, it's about working smart, right? So, but if you can work smart and hard, like, that's where some of the magic can happen. And so throughout the talk, I've got a lot of specific suggestions that I'm going to share, but things like free labor. If you get interns or volunteers and engage, I think it came up earlier, a lot of youth, right? To start early. So free labor, technology. I know we were talking about technology, so I'm a big technology entrepreneur. Just like a business, there's only two things you can really do. One is squish out the costs, right, to make things more profitable, and drive the revenues. And so, as I said, like, being very creative in both of those buckets is how you can hopefully not only compete but win.
I want to drill down into that. How do you reduce your cost? What are some of the things that you recommend?
So technology is a big one, right? So unfortunately, some people lose some jobs over that, but There's all kinds of ways to incorporate technology, and I talked about another one, which is free labor, right? So those are probably two of the biggest ways.
Any other suggestions?
Yeah, just to add on to that, the idea of free labor probably scares some people. I interned at one point, actually a couple times, different organizations as I was kind of coming up in my career, and some for free, some for, a stipend. I think if you're smart about it, it's not, quote unquote, abusing people, right? And no one wants to be known as the organization that's necessarily just churning out interns. But if you're finding, again, those people that are willing to share their talents, and these next gen donors are those people. They want to give more than just dollars to your organization. They actually want to be a part of the success, part of the program development, part of the change. So finding those people and really investing your time and energy into them so that they can help you become more efficient in the business you're doing and spend less dollars in doing it is, I think, a really positive idea.
Mm-hmm. And I think just to chime in on that, really looking at why are those individuals coming to your organization? What are they hoping to learn? How can you leverage your kind of capacity or your platform as an organization to really support them in return? Because they do definitely see that there is a value in volunteering or giving their time. And often with a younger generation where we don't have as much of, disposable income to donate, often another way is to contribute through their time and through their voice and through social media and sharing what they really believe. And so I think for me, it does sound a little bit problematic, the idea of free labor. But I think if you can really demonstrate that you're willing to invest your own time as well, and not just seeing it as a transactional relationship, a one-way relationship where you're giving back and making very clear what the opportunity is there for them. Speaking from a personal perspective, many of the jobs that I've received over the course of my career have been because I spent a lot of time volunteering with organizations and demonstrating the value that I could give to those organizations. And so definitely reframing and thinking about how you can support the folks that are coming to you and building on those relationships is really key, because I think it's much more than just perceiving them as free labor, for sure.
You're not just taking from them, it's literally you're giving them back.
Yeah, and for, I say free labor jokingly, but for the volunteer, there's obviously the reward of being part of a great cause and getting satisfaction out of that. But selfishly for that person, there's also other benefits that can accrue. I deal with a lot of immigrants, and it's often hard for them to get a job. They can't get work because they don't have a Canadian work experience. And how do you get a job if it's like a circular thing? And through volunteering, you're going to meet new people. You're going to create your own luck. I've written some books, and one of the things I talk about is building a personal brand. And so if you build your brand about being of service and being helpful, it's interesting what kind of opportunities can come out of it. Also, a lot of these larger charities, if you look at their boards, these are very successful people, CEOs of companies. And so it's kind of a sneaky way to kind of get into an organization and meet some of these people that you might not be able to meet. So there's lots of benefits from volunteering and providing that free labor.
I wanted to, could everybody raise their hand? If we, as we go along, if you have a question, and I see you, which I will look, we can. You left your hand up a little long, because we're gonna. Yes. Good point.
So my recommendation to that would be don't take on any volunteer, take on the volunteer, right? Channel that energy and that time and the resources from your organization into that person that you have interviewed and recruited, and you think that, yep, this is the one, they're passionate, they're motivated. You want somebody that from the get-go is self-sustainable, right? Again, they're a volunteer. I 100% understand that. You don't want to have to spend hours training them, or maybe you have to put in some time, but find the person that you get that gut instinct is no, they're going to be self-motivated.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I have a list of questions, but the one that's not on here is the one that came out of this morning's introduction, which is how can people in this room access that $60 million that TELUS has?
So when Dawn asked me
no
this,
pressure.
I just said, unfortunately, that's not my job. But what I can say is the TELUS community boards that Curtis spoke to this morning do a 4 times a year an application where you can actually have your work put in front of the community board, and they do a voting process to decide what's being funded. Of course, it's competitive. I actually learned this morning that it's very youth centric. So if you're dabbling in the area of youth, or your work impacts youth in some way or shape or form, and you can target that in an application, the deadline is actually today for the beginning of the year, but 4 times a year. So there will be another open window where the deadline will be the end of April, and then the grants would come out come June. But if anyone wants to know a little bit more, feel free to pull me aside today and we can chat about it.
Are there new ways to raise funds that we haven't talked about today, or that we should be talking about, whether it's crowdfunding or online or social media partnerships and so forth? Any suggestions?
Sorry, Don, before you go back to that question, I was going to go back to that question over there. So I understand it can be a challenge managing a lot of volunteers, but there's a lot of organizations that actually do that. I was on the Heart and Stroke Foundation board, and they've got a massive global, Canadian-wide volunteer network. Megan and I met through Room to Read, a charity started by John Wood, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit later too. But we've got a global organization that's run by chapters of volunteers all over the world, and it's a machine. So it can be done, and I wouldn't be shy about hiring someone, actually paying someone to manage that group. So it's not really a cost center. It's actually going to be an asset, because you're going to be getting a lot more labor out of the volunteers. But yeah, it can be done.
Good point.
And I think it really depends on like the mission and the mandate of the organization. In certain cases, it doesn't make sense if you have a very small staff team and you think that that's going to end up taking more of your time to manage a volunteer size. But I think what's interesting and what we've found, my co-founder Veronica is also here in the room, and we work a lot with volunteers, and we find that having very clear commitments from the beginning, expectations, setting that from the get-go, that way folks can screen and self-select whether that is an opportunity that they're able to commit to, and they know what they're signing up for, and that they also see the value in it. That really helps, I think, having a very clear process of intake, and also like thinking through the life cycle of what that is. And so if your organization knows that that's not something that they have the time to really invest the time and the energy into it, often the return on investment for setting up a volunteer program might not make sense for your nonprofit.
Yeah, and that's the key point, setting and managing expectations. So hopefully they can, I call it UPOD, UPOD, which stands for under promise and over deliver, as opposed to OPUD, which is over promise and under deliver, which is human nature. And I use those expressions and acronyms often. I actually trademark them also. But the tricky part of that is how do you fire a volunteer that's not doing their job, right? That's tricky, because they've put up their hand to try and help, and they're not doing their job, and you got to get rid of them. I don't have a good answer for that one, but it's tricky too.
It'll come. Does that help? That answer your question?
Yeah, I work for an organization of about 350 volunteers, and it's just, even if we have a volunteer paid coordinator, it's just, I mean, we're sort of an anomaly, but it's still, the whole organization sort of the support needed for it, and we're even wondering, looking at sort of shifting the model because of that. Like, I totally see your point.
So what about the question about new ways to fundraise? Volunteerism is certainly an important part of that, but any suggestions? Any things you've seen?
So one of the things is a concept that I learned from Chip and Shannon Wilson at their Imagine One Day charity, and they call it creatribution. So basically, you get people engaged and let them come up with any idea that they want to come up with to fundraise. Going back to Room to Read, so my daughter, when she was 7, she handmade some Christmas cards, and I photocopied them, and it was really cute. Her and a little brother were on our kitchen table, like cutting them up and wrapping them up, and they went door to door selling them. And that was just an idea that she came up with, and I think she raised $1,200 to send a few girls to school. But just, as I said, be creative and allow the people who are engaging with you to be creative versus telling them to do something. So I think that would be one suggestion I would share.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. Speaking to the Room to Read Vancouver chapter, we've had people throw rock concerts for us, do runs, do marathons in other countries in support of our local chapter. We've done like a Beers for Books model where you get all your people, you go to a pub and $1 or $2 per beer sale goes towards the cause. Not totally revolutionary, but all of those little events, when you mobilize people to get out and do something that they're passionate about or they're creative with, really does help, and it adds to a lot of fundraising dollars at the end of the year.
I think going back to Megan's original point about diversification, looking at what are the current streams of funding that you have right now. So is most of your funding through granting? Is most of your funding through individual donors or larger organizations, major sponsorships through corporations or through public and private sector? Looking at what that is currently and looking where the opportunity lies for you to grow that. Like, what is your ideal scenario? Where do you think, in terms of the trends, going back to our last talk about data, where has you've seen the most growth in terms of your impact and how much time you've spent in terms of increasing those and the return on investment? So looking at those and then figuring out then which stream are you going to continue to pursue or try to grow in terms of percentage of your overall budget?
I'm curious, is the events marketing or events market saturated? I mean, if I get another invitation to another gala, you can only do so much. And so 2 questions, I guess, it seems like we're saturated with events, and it seems like fundraising products have a shorter lifespan. So how do we deal with those things? Or is that true?
No, I think you're right. I think I also find the gala model is very it's exclusive, right? It's already segregating out different generations. There's a lot of people in my generation that don't go to galas every year to fundraise, and they still do fundraise, whether it's online or in person or through volunteering their time. So I think that there's definitely a little bit of fatigue. I think this new generation coming up where they don't necessarily want to go to a million events or a million galas in a year. I think what you can look to do again is finding the ways that you can tap into those people, through their natural network. But then on top of that, like we said, encouraging them to create maybe their own type of event. And these small events could raise thousands upon thousands of dollars, where you don't necessarily have to put your team to work to plan one massive event in a year if you're mobilizing this larger group to help do that for you.
And it's not necessarily about the dollars. Like when we work with Room to Read every year, our family annually donates to them, and we regularly fundraise. But a big part is also creating awareness, right? So through these things, again, you're going to maybe get some luck. Like someone that didn't know about the organization might hear about it, and that could lead to a big donation. So it can seem like a lot of work to do some of these smaller fundraisers, but again, that's a process of that could lead to something more significant.
Were you going to add to that?
I can jump in. I think, again, thinking about what the time investment is versus the impact, and also like what you're hoping to achieve. Is it solely to fundraise, or is it also to recognize major donors or major contributions, or, as Praveen offered, allowing other people to bring their own talents and skills and help contribute in a way that your team doesn't have to take on the entire kind of initiative of organizing, because that does take a huge time expense out of your organization. So figuring out whether that's where you want to spend your organization's time, or whether that's something that a volunteer committee can take on.
Just a bit of a segue, I guess, from this question, but it kind of leads into what we're talking about. I think one of the gaps that tends to exist when you're really mobilizing other people to help support your organization is bringing them together. It's amazing what the creativity of all these different groups of people, where that creativity will go when you bring them in the same room and you have all these passionate people. So, organizations that I volunteer with, a couple of them have been really, really good at, hosting a gathering or a meeting a couple times in a year, bringing these people together that don't know each other. And like Praveen talked about earlier, when you give that time, you're also expanding your network. So you're meeting more professionals that are very like-minded, and then it's also going to help your organization's goals get to where they need to be, and you're never going to regret, sort of investing that time as well.
Praveen, I'm going to start with you on this question. How can not-for-profits and charities create meaningful partnerships with the private sector?
I love that question because I got a great answer. Being a business guy, I try and, when I'm working with my nonprofits, try and bring in those business principles to them. And so concepts like sustainability and leverage and recurring revenue, which is two of my favorite words in the English language, Um, and so I'll give you a specific example of something I did, and I do this in my business life too sometimes, not often, but when I can do it, it's amazing. But basically I call it one-time work, lifetime pay. So basically you put a deal together, and I get money for a long time from that, right? And so if you can do that with a charity, so here's a specific example. One of the charities I helped start is called One Prosper. It's in Ottawa. It's a water-based charity that provides drip irrigation kits in India to lift farmers out of poverty. And so it was an Indian fellow in Ottawa that approached me, and he knew I was involved with Room to Read. John Wood was his hero, so he's like, "Can you teach me what your Room to Read did?" And so, anyways, I put a deal together for him where I had a local Indian family that's in organic foods. They were launching a new coconut water product. And so I said, "Look, you're Indian, we're helping farmers in India." Like basically, he would get it. And so this coconut water, a nickel from every sale of it, and it's listed on the bottom of the bottle, says a nickel goes to One Prosper. It's created this recurring revenue stream. So I think this is year 4. So I think the checks have gone from like $5,000 to $10,000 to $15,000. So it's actually been growing as the coconut water has become more popular. But basically, it was a great example of one-time work, lifetime pay for the not-for-profit. So if you can create some interesting partnerships like that, and I'm on the Vancouver Police Foundation board, and so they did something similar with sunglasses. The problem with sunglasses, you buy one, like you're not going to buy another one probably for a long time. So if you can do a deal on something that's a consumable or has a razor blade element to it, right? That's how you can create that recurring revenue.
Tessica, thoughts?
I don't think I have much to add to that. Yeah.
I would just say, like, just do your homework. Like, before you're approaching these organizations, understand, like, what their values are, what their goals are. And maybe that's the first approach, is that conversation of trying to gather some information from them. And then ask them, like, how can you help them get to their goal? And, like, how can you guys come together and have a very much a mutually beneficial relationship that way?
Are there any good examples locally where we've seen that happen?
I think Mealshare is a great example.
Okay.
It helps that I went to university with one of the founders, that I'm really well educated on what they do. But if you're not familiar, basically they every meal that's sold in their partner restaurants then provides a meal for a homeless person, which is such a lovely model. And they've done a really great job of expanding this over cities. It's a simple concept when you think about it, but how creative, right? How many restaurants out there probably don't have a way for them to give back? And now, just by providing proceeds to one or a couple meals on their menu, now feel charitable, and now are also educated on this large issue that needs solving, especially in our province.
I think it's a lot about relationship building. So looking at your existing donors as well and seeing which ones there could be potential donors that you could escalate that impact. And so I think part of the last conversation was talking about data, and I think tracking data is, or your impact and sharing your impact. So saying, for this amount, we were able to do this, and really sharing that. And so kind of illustrating the possibilities to them about how a greater contribution might be able to support them or support your organization.
No, and it's a great point, because when we're fundraising for startups, what we'll counsel the entrepreneurs is there's money for the sake of money, and there's a spot for that. We call it dumb money. But for the most part, we'd rather default to that smart value add money all day long, because it's just going to try and help itself by helping you however else it can beyond the check. So whether it's fundraising or some smart business advice or a connection. So as Tessica said, yeah, if you can find someone who's not just going to be a check and then provide some other support and benefit, like that's the ideal situation.
I guess that raises the question that Jim Collins raised years ago, that more not-for-profits should run like businesses.
Who here has heard of Room to Read? Okay, so maybe a third of the crowd. So a couple of minutes on it, and then there's an event coming up that I'd highly recommend everybody come to. So John Wood was the senior exec at Microsoft running their Asian operations, and he got burnt out. So he took a sabbatical and went to Nepal on a trek. And he saw a library, went to go visit it in the school, and there was no books. And the headmaster said, "Let me show you." They were all locked up, and there were things like Daniel Steele novels that backpackers left behind. So John's like, "Well, this is not what little kids should be learning how to read on." So the headmaster said, "Look, maybe one day, mister, you'll come back with some books." So John made a promise, and he did a book drive with his parents. And there's a really cool picture of him coming back with this yak with bags of books. That's how this charity was born, because he basically changed his life. He quit Microsoft to run this organization for the last 12, 13 years. And he's done it in a way where he's incorporated a lot of things he learned at Microsoft, right, that I talked about earlier. And so when I first met him, I was just so impressed, because being a business guy, it totally resonated. And so he's coming here, and Megan can provide some details to launch his third book. And so one of the things is when you want to get successful, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's an expression that pioneers, a lot of them, who were trailblazing, died because they got arrows in their backs. So success leads tracks. You just need to learn what other successful people have done and basically copy that or tweak that. So I would pick up his books. And Megan, do you want to talk about the event?
Yeah, admittedly being on maternity leave, I haven't been as close to it, but Sharon, who is in the back of the room, has been very close to John's event happening
Sharon, when's
at the
the
beginning
event?
of February. February 6th? 7th, sorry, I was a day off. So it's actually it's happening right across the street over here at the Rosewood Hotel Georgia. And so John has written 3 books, as Praveen had mentioned. The first one is called Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. It's my favorite by far. It's very, very inspiring. The second is Creating Room to Read, where he really talks about the bones of running a nonprofit. So it would probably resonate highly with everybody here, and how they structured this organization, how they failed, how they succeeded. It's very, very transparent, which is also how Room to Read is run, which is why I passionately support it as a volunteer. It's because I know the ins and outs. They don't hide the failures. They talk about them just as loudly as the successes. And I think that's a huge, huge piece of what motivates and inspires people is authenticity.
And his new book is available now
Yes.
on Amazon.
Right. It's Purpose Incorporated.
Yes, Purpose
Yeah,
Incorporated.
And so for Najid and the organizers, I have, I think, 100 copies of the book, but I would be pleased to offer up 50 of them to the crowd here, so you can figure out, who gets one.
Nice. Excellent.
Thank you.
Did I see a question? No? Okay. So this is a good one. What should the role of donors and fundraisers be for shaping and informing the changing regulatory landscape? What are the key regulatory issues, and what would you like to see changed regarding data protection, regulation, CRA issues, direct mail, cookie blocking, etc.? Who wants to go first?
Being a CPA, I can talk a little bit about that. So one of the big changes a number of years ago, as a lot of you may be aware, is you can accept shares of companies as donations. And it was a huge game changer, because a lot of business guys may be up a lot of money on their shares in a company, and they could now donate them to a charity and not pay tax on that gain. So a lot of the large donations for causes are done through shares. And there's also another thing called flow-through shares. So not to get too technical, but basically the government has this rule where if someone donates flow-through shares, which is usually a mining company or an oil and gas company, then there's an extra benefit. And the whole concept behind it was a lot of these exploration companies, they're not making revenue, so they don't need the tax losses. So they basically give the tax losses to the individual. And it basically can work out to where if you make $1 of a donation to a charity, it might cost the person 5 cents. So there's huge leverage opportunity in that. So I would understand a little bit more about how these flow-through share donations work, not just regular shares. And if there's someone in your donor base who's a high net worth individual, try and educate them on that to see if they can, use that to make a donation. So it's a phenomenal way to kind of
That's a great idea.
raise money, and hopefully the government won't take that away.
Tessica, thoughts?
No,
Megan?
Yeah, this is a complicated one, and I was when we went over this question earlier, I was saying how it kind of scares me, because I think that it changes so much when you talk about regulation, and in an increasingly digital world, we're seeing every single day organizations are being hacked and private information is being leaked. So I think data security is a huge one. I think that we're going to see forever and ever and ever to make sure that you are protecting your donors and that they're going to feel protected. So making sure you have something in place. If the investment is really, really difficult for your organization to make, then look at partnering with like a third-party vendor that does that really well, but somebody that has a strong reputation that you can rely on.
I'm curious if there's a regulatory issue or some hidden shadow part of running a not-for-profit that we haven't uncovered in this discussion. Anybody have something to offer or a question? We're doing okay. How has technology changed the way we give money, the way charities fundraise, and the way people choose to give and support the causes they care about? Phil touched on a number of things earlier, but what are some of the challenges like webs, apps, smartphones, social media, so forth?
For me, being part of this next generation of donors, I'm always fearful of how I'm donating my money to a cause because I'm scared of what's being skimmed, out of that donation. So I would say that's definitely one of the biggest challenges, I think, as you see more of these crowdfunding campaigns and things come to life. I still personally would very much prefer to go direct to that organization and know that the dollars I'm donating are actually going to the cause.
Tessica? Sorry, Praveen.
Go ahead. Yeah. I think that's an area that increasingly nonprofits should be looking towards to find ways to fundraise online, to crowdfund, to be able to reach audiences, because I think this generation is increasingly growing up as digital natives, and so that's where their first interaction with your organization might be through your impression from your website, from your social media channels, and certainly I'm speaking to a certain generation, to the kind of the millennial generation, but that's not just the future of your donors, but it's also the future of your organizations, the folks that are going to volunteer, that are going to be your champions, that might be board members for your nonprofits in the future, and so. I guess to take a page from the for-profit sector, looking at how you brand your organization and how you sell and share the story of your impact. Certainly, it's a different value set that you're sharing and that you're essentially selling to this audience, but really sharing what is the concrete impact of the dollars that are invested. And there are some organizations now that are sharing more and kind of open up the percentage of overhead that different organizations spend versus how much money is actually directly going to the cause itself. And so there's increasing transparency or expectations of transparency, and also literacy and openness from organizations to share that. That being said, I think it's a difficult narrative to counter, but I think it's important to emphasize the importance of overhead, because it does take dedicated staff time and dedicated resources in an organization. I don't think that we should undervalue that and look constantly to cut costs at the expense sometimes of programming, of evaluation, of sharing back. I think sometimes those short-term pains will lead to long-term gains.
Just to reiterate my point, I 100% support ethical overhead. I get that. Yeah, I'm a business person as well. My fear is where you have all these digital apps and all these different streams of how the money is getting to said organization, where there's little fees that are coming off. And so that's where my fear comes from. I just wanted to clarify.
And not to get too technical, but there's going to be a huge opportunity with the blockchain and cryptocurrencies, because you're going to see money that goes directly to charities or people on the ground, and not have these month delays that you hear about too. So I'm actually really quite excited about that. One other thing I would say is I know a buddy of mine, John Bromley, is going to be speaking later, but what Chimp's doing is I love what they have going on there. We're going to be moving our Family Charitable Foundation onto their platform, because John opened up my eyes, because he said, look, we're growing, and a concept that a lot of charities use is matching, right? So a match is a great way to double up or triple up even on a dollar. But John said, look, if you're going to be donating to a cause, I can throw it out to my network and do it as a match. So I can raise a lot more dollars for the dollars I'm going to do it. For example, at Covenant House, we're building a new building, so we're making a large donation there, but I'm going to put it out to the crowd and see if I can't raise more money off the Chimp platform.
Anybody else who comes to mind that uses technology really well as a role model or somebody that we should look to? Any ideas? Thoughts? Anybody in the room? Yes.
I don't
Canada-
personally use it, so I'm not as educated on it, unfortunately.
But good idea, good recommendation, thank you. Yes?
Can I ask a question? It's going back a little bit to the CRA questions and kind of millennial donors. With our charity, we actually have tax status in the U.S. We have a lot of U.S. supporters. And in Canada, we have a charity that doesn't have tax status that we do our advocacy work through, because during the Harper government, a lot of environmental organizations were being stripped of their status. And then we partner with Tides Canada on projects for tax receiving status.
how many people are actually expecting tax receipts, and how willing are people to give without that compensation when, if you're not, some high income earners like it as part of their year-end giving and reduce their taxes. And so our lower income people rely on it to at least help offset some other components of their tax profile as well. And we're having this conversation, and it makes me a little bit nervous because we have some people who make a $5,000 donation and specifically wanted to make sure they got a tax receipt, and you don't want to lose those people who are willing to give. So what kind of conversations have you had with donors around the tax receipting opportunities?
So we run into this with our local chapter Room to Read from time to time, depending on the level of donation and depending on the style of the event and what's going on. Sometimes it's possible to issue a tax receipt, and sometimes it's not. It's all on the individual. I think it's a really tough question to answer for the mass. Personally, I'm okay either way. If I'm passionate about the organization, I'm not necessarily going to get so hung up on how much money it might get me back at tax season. But I'm also not donating like foundation level of dollars. So Praveen might have a different input on that.
No, it's true, especially with the larger dollars. People want to get a tax receipt if they can, because it just reduces their cost. You would hope that someone would support the cause, as Meg said, regardless. But yeah, I've seen it go both ways, where you lose a donation because you can't give them a tax receipt.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can work easily with the Vancouver Foundation. That's what they specialize as, and then there's a huge benefit to people who donate 5,000 and up, and shares and everything you speak about. So it's they.
Yeah, we do
Yeah.
have one, but certain donations, if we're using it for causes that might be deemed political, we can't actually issue tax receipts.
Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little tough.
So she's saying if they're using the funding for something that could be seen as political, it's very hard for them to be able to tax receipt it. Same thing if you can't. Same thing if you're doing a large event, like a large scale event, and that's where some of the money is coming in. So people buy tickets for your event. You can't tax receipt we can't tax receipt all the tickets. You have to really show your what part actually went to donation, which can be a lot for small organizations.
And I think my only suggestion would be to go back to the folks that are donating to you and asking, like, would you be willing, or is there a certain amount if you're donating amount under this amount? Like, exactly, just ask
And it
them.
also it's campaign specific, right? Like, is every single one of your campaigns falling under this umbrella? Potentially, but you might have different campaigns throughout the year that aren't politically focused. I don't know the ins and outs of your work, so you might be able to tax receipt those, and unfortunately you just can't tax receipt the ones that are tied to politics.
Yeah, we funnel different things
Yeah.
to both sides, but it also complicates our system because sometimes there's those gray lines between projects where you are doing research and education, but then there's also an advocacy component, and being very clear with your donors where the line is drawn and how the funds are used. So it can start getting a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
And so
So I think going back to Praveen's point, you are definitely, depending on the level of donation, you're going to run into an issue where it's probably going to deter some donations. Whereas I think for the smaller income donors, it may not be as big of an issue.
I've
Phil, if you
also,
could- sorry.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
yeah, I've seen some people write checks from a corporation and disguise it some sort of a business expense, and so that's their business.
Phil, if we could bring out about 100 microphones, would we be okay?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we have a question. here.
I was just going to address that. Our organization's been around since the 50s, and we were originally a charity and lost charity status in 1999 because of our advocacy work, and our donations were cut by half. So, sucks.
What, you want to? Okay. we're
Thank
good?
her for sharing that.
Any groups here that are involved in disaster relief? The Red Cross is not here. I didn't see anybody from the Red Cross. That's a good question then. What?
We work with people after the disaster relief goes away.
Okay.
So, like we do bereavement services, and in Canada and the U.S., there's no government funding for bereavement services. So the Red Cross actually is one of the largest charities in Canada. They get a big chunk of that $200 billion each
Yeah.
from government. So after they go away, we do the cleanup.
So here's the question, and it'll be interesting to see how we react to it. With more global issues such as war, famine, and environmental disasters, and people giving directly to a particular cause or event, what's the impact on your group and on local charities?
It's another tough one. And again, I think it's really personal. If I'm giving to a natural disaster, that doesn't necessarily deter me from supporting, Room to Read or Girls Education or whatever the cause may be. But that's for me personally. I think it's really personal.
I think it's also that sense of urgency that there's like a collective moment where everyone's kind of pulling in and pulling their resources, and sometimes like within nonprofit organizations you can find that sense of urgency. Like I think we already talked about donation matching, where as a donor, all of a sudden I know that if I'm contributing a certain amount, I know that that will contribute double the amount. And so like being able to really leverage and harness those stories, and having a certain time bound, like really looking at the landscape and trying to figure out what is the issue that people are really connecting to, that's touching people's or tugging folks' heartstrings, and how does that connect to the work that you do?
I guess the question for me though is with more going on outside of our community, with more of us looking outward to help world situations, what's the impact on the local charity here? What happens? Because there's only so many dollars to go around.
For sure. But we all know that charity begins at home, so a lot of the stuff we do is for organizations in our community, but we all live in this global community as well. And so we've taught our kids that it's like the meet a we model, right? You do something locally and do something away. So I think it's just the right way to approach things. If it cuts into some local dollars, unfortunately it's going to cut into some local dollars.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Businesses are increasingly focused on developing a social purpose. We've heard about it from John Wood. Some people have raised concerns that as more businesses adopt the characteristics of the not-for-profit sector, that it may remove the unique role of charities in the eyes of the public. Any thoughts?
I think there's two different kind of ways of looking at it. One, you can see it as a zero-sum game where it's corporations versus nonprofits. But the other way of looking at it is seeing it as a win-win solution, where you know that increasingly there's an expectation for for-profit organizations to have a CSR side, to have a social impact side as well, and to be able to position your organization as a nonprofit that can help provide them some of that social capital. Of course, you need to take into account what operations, what is the impact of their work in the world, and whether that aligns with your own social capital as an organization and the brand that you want to share. But really not undervaluing the work that you do. I think often as a nonprofit, it's difficult to like pinpoint directly, not who the benefactor of your work is, but to match the benefactor. Often the benefactor of your work might not necessarily be the people that are in positions to fund that work, right? And so being able to frame this as a collective benefit and to share how that really directly impacts the bottom line of for-profit corporations is really key, so that you can really leverage, hey, this is the value that I can give to your organization through meeting also our own nonprofits or organizational objective.
I think as you see this space grow too, you really do have to look at collaboration and think like, are there a bunch of other organizations out there that are essentially trying to get to the same goal that we're trying to get to, and does it make more sense for us to work together than against each other? And sometimes that can be a hard question to ask, and sometimes the answer is not necessarily what you want to hear. But collaboration and creating economies of scale, especially to help benefit the cause, which is the higher purpose, may be a little bit more of a solution to this landscape where you just see, every business that opens is now have some sort of nonprofit, underlying giving model.
Also, you're seeing some really unique companies being formed that could be a charity, but they're more of a for-profit social impact venture. One of the ones that we're involved with is called the Plastic Bank. So it's actually dealing with the whole issue of global plastic that's ruining the oceans and the environment, and also alleviating poverty. So we've created a currency out of plastic. We're encouraging people all around the world to gather the plastic, take them to our centers, and they get paid for it. So we're helping the environment and alleviating poverty. So it's a really interesting business model.
We have a question in back.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to go back on the previous question, talking about some of the sort of the global crisis. We're a consulting agency. We work with a number of different organizations, including some larger global brands like Amnesty International, Oxfam. And I think what we see is when there is a crisis, whatever that may be, there's sometimes a kind of a momentary blip and some resources get redirected to that crisis, whatever it be. But I think going back to what Vanessa was talking about this morning, if you have a really strong and compelling message, you might not get the donations right then, but as long as you're always delivering on that, you'll get them over time. So I think that's where some charities might lose out, is if they're not really giving that engaging, compelling message, they might see those donations disappear, whereas others will still get them. It just may take another month or two after the crisis kind of clears.
A great point. I think what fascinates me about that question is if you follow the Department of Defense report that was published in, I think, 2013, they're talking about their expectation is another 30 induced climate change wars, which puts another billion people on the planet displaced. And that changes the game for disaster relief organizations and for all communities around the world. So if you believe it, if you're Donald Trump, you probably don't. But if you believe some of that, it will have an impact on all of us somehow, and certainly all of our organizations. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out and what we can do about it today. What's the impact of diversity and gender equality in the not-for-profit sector, and how does it impact fundraising?
I love this question. I don't think that this topic should be looked at any different than it is in business. I think you want to see diversity amongst your decision makers, amongst your boards, your volunteers. The more broad the range of brains that are coming to the table, the better the ideas. It's definitely been shown. It's very, very tried and true. So I wouldn't say that it's any different when you look at the business sector at all.
I think especially with the recent kind of Me Too campaign, and I think this is something that now it's finally boiling to this talk where folks are talking about it all over the place. There's an increasing expectation that gender and diversity inclusion, it's not just an afterthought, but that it is reflected in not just in the organization, but in the leadership of the organization. And often when I look at organizations, I look at not just who are on their staff team, but who is on their board, because that really reflects the decision making of their organization. And time again, you see that the more diverse the organizations, the more varied views, perspectives there are, and that definitely adds value to the organization, not just I think internally, but also communicating that message externally and setting a tone by leading by example.
It also sways my decision to where I'm giving money. If I look at an organization and it's run by a bunch of old white men, I'm probably not going to give to them because I'm not passionate about that leadership, to be quite frank. So it really does sway donor dollars, at least for me, and I would say most likely for the next generation of donors.
Mm-hmm. I think just building one more piece to that, diversity, but also looking at, so if your organization is looking to impact a certain group, are those folks actually represented at the decision-making table? So that I think there's increasingly this awareness of kind of the heropreneur, or kind of folks that are just flying in with an idea of how I'm going to save the world without any strong understanding of those communities and the long-term impact of the work that they have there. And so definitely I think water projects overseas, and I think there's so much value. I think you can't argue that folks need their basic needs, but I think I really like the example because there was a personal connection. There was folks from that culture, from that background, that were able to really be able to share more and to build value, because in the long term, those communities that you're hoping to impact, they're the ones that will be living with the consequences, whether they're positive or negative, of the impact that you're doing. And so being very mindful of the leadership of your organization, and whether you're including them not just as an advisory group that you consult with, but as truly the decision-making, or part of the decision-making body at least, of the programming and of the direction of the organization.
Also in Vancouver, we live in such a rich, ethnic, diverse community, and so often I've tapped into different ethnic sectors to tap into the rest of their community, right? So I don't really know that many Filipino people, and so I get someone who's Filipino to go talk to all his Filipino friends. A specific example in my situation was Children's Hospital tapped me on the shoulder to help raise $3 million for a program through the Indian community. And so I got the family that owns Nature's Path Foods to come up with $1 million. We did it on a match basis. And they wanted me to raise the $3 million over 5 years, and I did it in 2. But that was a big part of getting that help there. But it was an example of being able to tap into the community, because I'm involved in the community very easily and successfully.
Maybe just jumping in one
Sure.
last point to build on that is that if you don't have that diversity on board or as part of your organization right now, you are potentially missing a huge community of folks that you could tap on the shoulder, whether that's to donate to your organization or to be volunteering or contributing in some other way. And so figuring out how you can make your organizations more inclusive and having an equitable lens, so that even understanding, like knowing where your organization is currently, you can't change overnight, but starting to take steps to educate, to have professional development opportunities about diversity and inclusion, and then slowly building out a plan for how to actually transition your organization into a way where it's truly representative of the community that you're trying to serve, but also the community more at large that you're hoping to be able to engage and bring along in this movement that you have with your nonprofit.
Thank you. I'm looking for those beautiful questions, so if you have one, think about it, and I only have one more, and it's for Praveen, and each year not-for-profits and charities start at zero. So everybody in this room has pressure every year as a new fiscal begins to figure out what to do and raise money, and there's an awful lot of anxiety in that process. Any suggestions how to relieve that anxiety?
So I touched on one earlier, is being creative to figure out how ways to get recurring revenue, right, through partnerships. But another one is that multi-year donation strategy, right? So even with Room to Read, I'd educate someone on the charity, and then my request was, can you make this your charity choice for the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? So it's not like I got to repeat it with that person every year, right? So if you can get them to, donate regularly, that's probably a second suggestion I'd share.
Okay.
Just on top of that too is that as you look at these millennials, I couldn't remember the name of it, the millennials, as they're kind of coming up and are going to become the next donor stream, looking at like reoccurring donations within a year. So whether maybe it's monthly, maybe it's not, maybe it's bi-monthly, maybe it's quarterly, but making the ask for smaller amounts over the course of a year, which is really consistent. It's really helpful in the long run. And also it feels like less of an impact from the donor, who might be thinking like once a year for me to do X thousands of dollars is significant. But if I'm doing $250 quarterly, I can handle that. So it's just kind of shifting that mindset also.
Anyone else? We have a question on the floor.
Hi there. I'm curious where you think that the discussion of admin rates in organizations fits into that appeal conversation now, whether you're responding to one or you're making that appeal, especially with looking at these investments in technology and inclusion and that sort of requirement.
I think, again, like transparency is key. So of course these costs are going to happen. You're operating an organization, but I think if you're really honest with it, and when you look at the history of an organization, have they made, maybe let's call it software for an example, but have they invested in software for significant chunks every single year? Well, that might not necessarily show that the organization is being run the smartest from a donor perspective, because they can't seem to sort that out for me. So I know that I'm constantly putting so much money into this administration that isn't necessarily organized. But if you're transparent, you're forthcoming and saying, these are our big challenges, this year. And I know we keep saying Room to Read, but they do this really, really well at their head office in San Francisco. And they'll have a 5-year strat plan. And in that plan, it will say, hey, we need to overhaul these systems. It's a huge issue. Our I can't talk at all today. Our customer service management system needs to be completely redone because it's archaic. But then your donors are then reading that plan. They're with you on that journey, and they understand, well, in order for you to continue to have the impact you're having, I say yes to that admin cost, because you need to have that overhead cost to organize or to be a successful organization.
Not directly to answer your question, but I just wanted to pivot back to that original question of, ending the year at zero. With most of the organizations nonprofit organizations, whether I've sat on their boards or been more on the staff side, we've never budgeted to zero. So there is always a carryover from the previous year to the next. And with certain organizations, especially for insurance purposes, that was mandatory. That was required for us to actually hold a certain amount and to be building up a piece that we didn't touch, but was in case that something happened. And so I think that's very common within budgeting, where you're kind of looking at when your your major donations are coming in and modeling that the average over the course of the year, and then also looking at when are your major expenses kind of going out, and making sure that you're not just netting it zero to a zero at the end of the year. Yeah.
We have another question.
Oh, sorry, I was going to add something to that as well. So if you can also, it's tricky because you're always focused on the short term and just surviving. But if you can follow that wealthy barber strategy of, saving 10% for the long term and building an endowment, where the endowment can then, earn 5% a year, that's kind of typically what they would earn, then you've created another recurring revenue stream source. But it takes a while to build an endowment that's significant enough, but someone's just got to start the process. So if you start it, hopefully at some point you'll actually have a nice chunk of money that's sitting that you don't touch ever, but it's generating interest income to help sustain.
Great idea. We have a question.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys have all had different experiences serving on boards, interacting with board members. What would you recommend in terms of board involvement in fundraising? How to best utilize boards? What should board members be expected to do? What do they want to be asked to do? What do they not want to be asked to do? Yeah, speak to that.
That's a great question. I think your board doesn't want to necessarily be looked at as just the wallet or, again, maybe just that like arm reaching network. So lean on them for their talents, lean on them for the resources that they might be able to bring to the table. But it's going to be an individual conversation with every single person that's a key contributor or donor to your organization of, how can I help you this year? Because you guys are always helping us. How can we help you? And so I think once you start to have those like really honest conversations of where they may want to be, you might have some members that say, no, I'm good. I'm actually super happy to be where I'm at. Or you're going to have the people that say, hey, I really want to help you change this program. Or I think there's a bit of an issue here. Or I love what you guys are doing here. Can we build on it? But they're going to start to bring those ideas to the table that will be beyond the donor dollars.
Mm-hmm. One more?
Oh, I was just going to make a comment. As we're talking, I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking as a charity, representing a charity and a nonprofit, I have to be also mindful about who I'm getting into bed with, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm quite concerned that I have to make sure that whichever businesses that I'm partnering with or looking for funding from, they align with my values. And bottom line is, corporations are responsible to their shareholders, and I'm responsible to my community. And so like the example that you gave earlier at one time, I think it was the flow-through dollars with oil and gas companies. Well, if I was an environmental organization, I don't want to be getting into bed with them, but it's also really concerning, and I just think it was important to make sure that that was said.
Yep.
I'd like to speak to that directly. There's a very concrete example of this. The Indigenous Climate Action, it's a relatively new organization, but they were awarded $150,000 from Aviva Fund. And after that public announcement was made, they actually found out that Aviva, many of their investments were in oil and gas, and they decided that didn't align with their values. And so they publicly made an announcement and wrote a letter to Aviva and shared that, hey, we're not taking any of this, like this is great, and this is a huge amount for us. But I think ultimately, like the folks that we're representing and the work that we're trying to do against climate action doesn't align with those values. And I think, you can criticize that, but I think for them, they're speaking to their base. They're speaking to the folks that they're going to draw other donors and other folks that are really like, whoa, this team really lives their values and are sharing them on the outside. And so definitely there are moments where you're giving up, I think, funding right now, but I think in terms of the long term, that's building their social capital, that's building their brand recognition, and that's really, I think, important for them in their work. So thank you for bringing that up for sure.
I want to thank everybody for your attention, for asking beautiful questions, for being engaged. Most importantly, I want to thank our panel for joining us and sharing what they have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I've got one final tip and suggestion for everybody. Who here would love some smart value-add money? All right. So there's an organization in Vancouver called Social Venture Partners, which I've been a part of for a number of years. And we're just going to be going through another grant cycle. And so it's been around for about 17 years in Vancouver. We've given away, I think, $8 million over the years, $500,000 last year. And grants range from $30,000 to up to $150,000. And so it's called Social Venture Partners. And what happens is you don't just get the money from, there's about 170 of us that then partner up with the charity. We may not be on your board, but we'll be like advisors and work very closely with you. So provide you that smart, hopefully, business advice and guidance over and above and beyond the check.
Do you guys have a specific focus? Or is it very broad?
Not really, yeah,
Okay.
but it's all local community stuff. Those are two big categories for sure. Yeah, but we do a lot of downtown east side stuff too.
And when's the next deadline?
I not sure, but it's probably on our website.
It's ongoing.
Yeah.